Betrayed, cast aside, now they beg for my help. For as long as I can remember, my older brother George was the sun, and I was merely a shadow cast in his glow. He was the golden child, the undeniable favorite, the one who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. And he knew it. He reveled in it. While I scraped by on crumbs of their affection, he feasted on their love, their money, and their unwavering support. When we were kids, he took every opportunity to remind me of my place. His fists proved it, his words reinforced it. And when I turned to my parents for protection, they laughed it off. Brother's roughhouse, my father would say, as if broken bones and bruised pride were just a rite of passage. The imbalance stretched beyond our childhood. When I got my first girlfriend, George turned on the charm, relentlessly flirting until she was so uncomfortable she left me. I raged, I pleaded, I demanded justice. My parents shrugged. "You're being childish," they told me, as if my pain was a joke. Vacations? George got them. New toys? George got them. A car? Well, when I asked for one, they said no. But when George, who kept failing his driving test, finally passed, they handed him the keys to a brand new ride. By the time I graduated high school, my disillusionment was complete. George's graduation had been a grand affair, a night of celebration and overflowing pride. Mine? My father didn't even show up, and my mother barely made it on time. That night, George texted me, "You'll never measure up. You should know by now, they don't love you." I cried myself to sleep. Then, I made a decision. I was done trying. Moving out was supposed to be my escape, but they treated it as a victory. One less mouth to feed. One less burden. They never supported me, never helped with college, never cared that I had to juggle full-time work with my studies just to survive. When I graduated, they didn't even bother to come. Meanwhile, George floundered. He dropped out of university, burned through thousands of dollars our parents handed him, and hopped from one failed job to the next. He dabbled in day trading, made some money, lost even more, and still walked around as if he was superior to me. I let him talk. I let him preen. I let him pretend. Because I had something he didn't, success. Then, everything changed. My father's business, the small manufacturing firm he had built from the ground up, was crumbling. His manager had jumped ship, and now, with bankruptcy looming, he was desperate. He called both George and me to lunch, a rare event, signaling just how dire things were. Sitting across from us, he laid it all out. He needed help. He needed someone to step up, to save the company before it collapsed completely. I said nothing, because I knew, despite my presence at that table, this was meant for George. It was always meant for George. But George? He scoffed. He waved it off like an afterthought, like our father's blood, sweat, and tears were nothing but dust beneath his feet. He refused outright, dismissing the company as beneath him, a waste of his so-called talent. My father begged. He pleaded. He nearly broke. And George? He walked away. For the first time in my life, I saw my father, this man who had never spared a second thought for me, look at me with something different. With hope. With desperation. I could have turned him down. I should have turned him down. But I didn't. I told myself it wasn't for him, or for my mother, or even for the family name. It was for me, to prove I could do what they never believed I could. So I stayed. I sacrificed. I poured my own savings into that business, worked relentless hours, fought tooth and nail to keep it afloat. And then, after 5 long years, years of struggle, of late nights, of rebuilding from the ashes, everything changed again. And that's where the real story begins. I was the driving force behind our company's growth, setting up an international website, creating order from chaos in our documentation, and implementing a quality system that nearly met ISO 9001 standards. I refined our production tests, slashing defects, and when the team was swamped, I didn't hesitate to roll up my sleeves, packing boxes, scrubbing floors, hauling supplies. Meanwhile, my father... He barely grasped the technology and only emerged when major deals were on the table. In reality, I was the one steering the ship. And as the business flourished under my leadership, my parents began to see my worth. I was sure I'd inherit the company one day. I had no issue sharing it with my brother, if he ever cared. My bond with my parents was improving. They no longer blatantly favored my brother over me, and for once, they respected me. Or at least, I thought they did. Even my grandparents were delighted to see me finally being treated as a real son. Then, 3 years ago, George announced his engagement. The news blindsided us, none of us even knew he was dating anyone. Turns out, he'd met Donna just a month prior, and now they were rushing into a wedding. Alarm bells rang in my head. They barely knew each other. When I voiced my concerns, George dismissed me, sneering that I should stay out of his affairs. My opinion didn't matter just because I earned more than him. After that, I made it a point to stay out of his life. Once George was married, everything changed. Donna wasted no time cutting my parents off, complaining that they were too overbearing. My brother stopped replying to their messages, leaving my mother heartbroken over losing her golden child. For 2 years, he was a ghost. Then, out of nowhere, he resurfaced. I had no clue he was back until my father failed to show up for a crucial meeting. When I called, he casually informed me that George had returned for good. The suddenness of it all unsettled me. That evening, my parents invited me to dinner, hinting at something important. Over the meal, they revealed that Donna had cheated on George and left him for someone else. I wasn't shocked. Donna always made more money than him, and knowing my brother's track record, I doubted he had held onto a stable job. My parents, however, were oddly cheerful, ecstatic that George was back for good. They saw his return as a win. I, on the other hand, had no idea the disaster that was about to unfold. Later that night, my father called me and George into his study. As he shut the door, he turned to me with an unreadable expression. Then, he dropped the bombshell, "Start looking for a job. Your services are no longer needed. As of tomorrow, your brother is taking over your position." I sat frozen, waiting for him to elaborate. But George beat him to it, smugly declaring that he was finally ready to take charge. My father nodded, confirming that I was no longer necessary. My mind reeled. How could he discard me so easily after I'd poured my time, energy, and savings into building the business? I pushed back, arguing that I had turned our failing company into a success. Couldn't George learn the ropes first instead of waltzing into power? But George scoffed, stating outright that I had only been keeping his seat warm. The business was always his, and I needed to accept that. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I reminded my father that without me, there wouldn't even be a company left to inherit, but he simply stated that I was an employee, one he had every right to fire. To spare me the embarrassment of a notice period, he wanted me gone immediately. Desperate, I asked if my mother had agreed to this. Maybe she could talk some sense into him. But my father's answer shattered that hope. She wanted this all along. With George staying, she had her perfect family back. Betrayal seared through me. They had used me when it was convenient and cast me aside the moment their favored son returned. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. If this was their decision, then I wanted my savings back, every cent I had invested in keeping this business afloat. That was the least they could do. The moment the words left my mouth, my father and brother's expressions darkened. George was livid, demanding to know how I could dare to ask for my own money back where our parents had spent so much raising me. My father nodded in agreement, saying I had made my choice to invest and had no right to regret it now. George then went further, sneering that I was an ungrateful brat. That was the breaking point. Fury exploded out of me. You have no idea what I endured growing up in your shadow, constantly overlooked, constantly made to feel less. I gave everything to this business, saved it from bankruptcy, and now I'm the one who's selfish for wanting what's mine. My father's face twisted with rage. His voice was ice when he spat out his final decision. You want money? You're ungrateful, and you'll get nothing, not the business, not a cent, not even a place in my will. Now, get out. The weight of his words crushed me. My dream of inheriting the business, of finally securing what I had built, it all crumbled in an instant. The rejection stung deeper than I ever thought possible. Taking a steadying breath, I met my father's gaze. Fine. Keep your business. Keep your money. I'll start from scratch. And one day, you'll regret this. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out, refusing to let them see me break. That was the last time I ever heard from them. Eventually, my grandparents learned what had happened. Furious, they confronted my parents. But by then, the damage was done. 6 months have passed since I walked away from my family and the business I built. The first few weeks were brutal, accepting that I had to start over, that my own family had cast me aside. It hurt. But that pain fueled something in me, determination. At first, finding a job seemed impossible. I hadn't worked a standard job in years. But then, an idea struck me. Why not take my expertise to the competition? I reached out to rival companies, showcasing my experience, how I had transformed a struggling business into a success. To my surprise, multiple firms were interested. I attended interviews, and soon enough, I secured a job. This was my second chance. A clean slate. And I was more than ready to prove that I didn't need my family's name to succeed. Brick by brick, I was going to rebuild. And this time, it would all be mine. Rebuilding my shattered confidence after my family's rejection wasn't easy, but as the months passed, I found solid ground, not just in my career but in my own sense of self. Without the weight of their toxicity, I flourished, discovering a strength I never knew I had. Life was finally falling into place when, out of nowhere, my parents resurfaced. At first, I ignored their calls, thinking they'd eventually give up. But the ringing never stopped. The text messages piled up. Curiosity got the best of me, and after 6 months of radio silence, I finally picked up. Their voices crackled with unease, no warm greetings, no remorse, just a desperate plea for help. Their electricity had been cut off, and they wanted me to foot the bill. Stunned, I let their words sink in. No, how have you been? No acknowledgement of the time lost. Just an expectation that I'd come to their rescue. Keeping my voice steady, I told them to ask their golden son for help instead, and not to bother me again. That's when my mother broke down in tears, and my father, voice tight with urgency, confessed the full extent of their disaster. The family business, once their pride, was on the brink of collapse. Turns out, their beloved son had squandered nearly 90% of their savings, everything, even their retirement fund, chasing quick riches in crypto and day trading. He had convinced them it was a golden opportunity, that their money would multiply overnight. Instead, one brutal market crash wiped it all away. As if that weren't enough, he had run the family business into the ground. Employees despised him, clients vanished, and contracts slipped through his fingers. The empire they once cherished had crumbled at his hands. I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh at the irony. The very people who dismissed me had the audacity to beg for my support now. I reminded them of how they'd cast me aside, how they had stripped me of my rightful place in the family business and inheritance. If they had forgotten, I certainly hadn't. Their voices grew sharper, throwing accusations at me. They claimed I owed them for my childhood, that I should be a better son. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to stay calm. I laid it all out, the years of favoritism, the mistreatment, the money I had poured into their business, never to see a dime in return. I warned them, if they contacted me again, I would take legal action to reclaim what was mine, even if it meant forcing them to sell their home. That was the final straw. Our conversation exploded into a fiery exchange, but I refused to budge. No amount of guilt-tripping would change my mind. Finally, I hung up, feeling something I hadn't in years, liberated. They had gambled everything on their perfect son and lost. And I was finally free. Since then, the calls haven't stopped. Relatives, my brother, even people I barely spoke to before, all urging me to do the right thing. I was being cruel, they said. The only ones standing by my side were my grandparents, the only family that ever truly cared for me. Everyone else? They refused to see the truth. They clung to the illusion my parents crafted. The backlash only worsened when my parents reached out to an extended cousin, spinning a sob story that painted them as struggling victims and me as the heartless son who refused to lift a finger. They erased the truth, twisting the narrative to protect my brother's image. And, of course, everyone fell for it. I read the messages flooding my phone, the accusations, the disappointment. They thought I was selfish, ungrateful. But I wasn't staying silent anymore. I had kept my mouth shut for too long. After a long conversation with my grandparents, I made my decision. This weekend, I would set the record straight. No more lies. No more half-truths. I would tell them everything, the years of being treated like an outsider, the way I was thrown out of the business without a second thought, and the money I had invested, only to be cast aside when their golden child returned. They needed to know the truth. And I was ready to tell it. This morning, I followed through. I sent a mass email to every relative who had called or messaged me, demanding to know why I had abandoned my parents. I didn't sugarcoat a single thing. I laid out every detail, the mistreatment, the blatant favoritism, the inheritance I was robbed of. I told them exactly how much money I had put into the family business, only to be discarded like I never mattered. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. I hit send, my hands shaking slightly, and then, relief. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. Whether they chose to believe me or not, I had spoken my truth. And that was all that mattered. 3 months have passed, and my life has taken a turn for the better. Some relatives reached out, shocked and apologetic. They had no idea what I had endured. They offered sympathy, even confronted my parents about their lies. I don't know what was said, but the silence from my parents and brother afterward spoke volumes. Of course, their final act was predictable, furious messages calling me childish and immature for airing family matters in public. I responded once, and only once. I told them I was done, that I didn't care if they ended up on the streets. If they contacted me again, legal action would follow. Then I blocked them. And for the first time, they finally got the message. Since then, life has been peaceful. My job is going well. I've started therapy, working through the wounds of my past. Healing is a slow process, but for the first time, I feel like I'm moving forward. I visit my grandparents when I can. They're the only family I need. And as for my parents, they made their choices. Now, they have to live with them. To everyone who has supported me, thank you. Your encouragement has meant more than I can ever express. This journey isn't over, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be.